There is a man in the Bible who never died, not a man who came back from the dead, not a man who survived impossible odds, a man who simply stopped being here. One moment he walked the earth, the next he was gone. No burial, no grave, no body, no last words recorded in Scripture, just a silence where a life used to be. And the Bible gives us only 8 words to explain it. 8 words that have haunted theologians, scholars, and ordinary readers for thousands of years. Think about that. Every human being who has ever lived on this earth has died, or will die. Death is the one thing that has never made an exception. Not for kings, not for prophets, not for the righteous, not for the wicked. Every man, every woman, every soul that drew breath eventually stopped. Except one. One man in the entire history of recorded Scripture, before the cross, before resurrection, before anything we might call a theological framework for such things, simply walked with God, and then walked right out of this world. No funeral, no eulogy, no mourners. God just took him. And the real question, the one that every generation has asked and never fully answered, is not how it happened. The real question is why. Why this man? Why then? What was it about him that set him apart from every other soul who walked this ancient earth? The real story is deeper than you think. To understand Enoch, you have to understand the world he lived in. Genesis chapter 5 is not the most exciting chapter in the Bible to read casually. It reads like a list, a long, repetitive list of names and numbers. Adam lived this many years. He had a son. He lived more years. He died. Seth lived this many years. He had a son. He lived more years. He died over and over, name after name, death after death. And that repetition is not accidental. It is the point. The writer of Genesis is painting a picture, and the picture is grim. Humanity began, humanity multiplied, and humanity died. That is the relentless drumbeat of the chapter. Born, lived, died. Born, lived, died. The shadow of mortality falls across every name on that list. It does not matter how long they lived. Adam lived 930 years. Methuselah, the longest-lived human in all of Scripture, reached 969 years. And still, he died. These were not short, fragile lives. These were centuries of breathing, building, fathering children, watching civilizations form. And all of it ended in death. But there is something else happening in Genesis 5 that most readers miss when they skim past those long lists of numbers. This chapter covers an enormous span of time, from Adam, the very first man, to Noah. And in that span of time, the world was not standing still. It was moving, and the direction it was moving was downward. By the time we reach the end of this genealogy and step into Genesis 6, we read something devastating. God looks down at the earth he created and sees that the wickedness of man was great, that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. God looked at what humanity had become and was grieved. He was grieved to his heart. That is the world Enoch was born into. That is the world he lived in, not a world of innocence, not a world untouched by sin, a world that was, generation by generation, moving further from God. A world where the gap between heaven and earth was widening with every passing century. And into that world, into that long, grim list of names marching steadily toward death and judgment, God placed one man who would be different. His name was Enoch. Genesis 5, verse 21. That is where we first meet him. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah, that is all, a name, an age, a son. Nothing in those words prepares us for what comes next. Nothing signals that this man is different from the others on the list. He is just another entry, another name. And then, in verse 22, everything changes. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Walked with God. That is the phrase. 2 words in the original Hebrew, just 2 words, that separate Enoch from every other name in that chapter. Look back at the list. Adam lived, Seth lived, Enoch lived, Kenan lived. Nobody else in this chapter is described this way. They existed, they had children, they died, but Enoch walked with God. Now we need to stop here and ask a real question, because in casual reading that phrase can wash over us like background noise. Walked with God. We have heard it so many times in religious settings that it can lose its weight. But what does it actually mean? In the Hebrew world, to walk with someone meant companionship. It meant direction. It meant a shared journey. You do not walk with someone who is a stranger. You do not walk with someone whose path is going the opposite direction from yours. To walk with someone is to move together, in the same direction, at the same pace. And to walk with God, to walk with the living God, the Creator, the one whose holiness is described elsewhere in Scripture as a consuming fire. That is not a casual stroll. That is alignment. That is surrender. That is a life organized not around personal comfort, not around the values of the surrounding culture, but around the will and the presence of God. The rest of the people in Genesis 5 were living. But Enoch was walking. There is a difference. He walked with God for 300 years, not 3 days, not a season of spiritual awakening that faded when hard times came. 3 centuries, 300 years of consistency, 300 years of a life pointed in one direction. And then verse 24, 8 words in the English, 4 in the Hebrew. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He was not. That is the phrase. Not that he died. Not that he fell sick or was buried or returned to dust like every other name on that list. He was not. He ceased to be present in this world because God took him. The word translated took in Hebrew is lakash. It means to take, to receive, to carry away. It is used elsewhere of God reaching down and acting, of God being the subject, God being the one who initiates. God did not receive Enoch because Enoch found a way out of death. God reached into time and took him. That is the record. That is all Genesis tells us. And for centuries, that was enough to change everything. Let us sit with this for a moment. Go back to that list in Genesis 5. Read through it again with fresh eyes. Every single person on that list, every father, every son, every man who lived for centuries and built a life on this ancient earth, ends the same way. And he died. 3 words, a full stop, the end. Adam, and he died. Seth, and he died. Enoch, and he died. Kenan, and he died. Mahalalel, and he died. Jared, and he died. Then Enoch, and he was not, for God took him. No, and he died. The formula breaks, the only formula that has held since the beginning of human history. Since God told Adam that in the day you eat of it you shall surely die. That formula breaks for one man in the entire pre-flood world. Why? The text gives us the answer, and it is the same answer it has given us twice already. He walked with God. But here is what we need to understand about that walk. Because it is easy to read walked with God and picture something peaceful and uncomplicated. A man in a garden, at peace with himself, free from the struggles that everyone else faced. But that is not the world Enoch inhabited. Enoch lived in a world that was becoming more corrupt with each generation. He lived in a world where, as we will see, God's patience was reaching its limit. He was not sheltered from that world. He was surrounded by it. He fathered children into it. He lived his life in it. And yet, generation after generation, while the world moved one direction, Enoch moved another. That is not passivity. That is active, intentional, costly choice. Think about what it means to walk with God in a world that is not walking with God. It means being different. It means being out of step with the culture around you. It means your values, your habits, your priorities, your very way of seeing the world is oriented towards something, towards someone, that most of the people around you have chosen to ignore. Enoch was not famous in the way the world makes people famous. Scripture does not record his achievements, his battles, his kingdoms, his wealth. What Scripture records is his walk, his relationship, his direction. And God noticed something about this man, not his power, not his genius, not his position, but his walk, his faithfulness, his steady and persistent movement toward God over the course of 300 years drew the attention and the pleasure of the living God in a way that is unique in all of pre-flood human history. What does it take to live that way? What does it cost? It costs everything that Enoch's neighbors were holding on to. It costs the comfortable compromise. It costs the slow drift that happens when you stop paying attention to which direction you are walking. It costs the 1,000 small decisions to turn toward God instead of away from him, every day for 300 years. Enoch paid that cost, and Scripture tells us that God took note. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. We keep returning to this verse because it is the axis around which everything else in Enoch's story turns. He was not. In the original Hebrew text, there is an abruptness to this phrase that the English translation preserves well. Enoch was here, and then he was not. The narrative does not smooth it out. It does not give us a gentle transition or a theological explanation. It simply states the fact: a man who was present in the world became absent from it, and the agent of that absence was God. Now some have read this and asked whether the text might mean that Enoch simply died. That he was not is just a different way of saying he died. But the New Testament closes that question definitively, as we will see in a moment. What the Genesis text alone gives us is this: the man who walked with God was removed from this world by God. The same God he had been walking with for 300 years reached into the flow of ordinary human existence and took him out of it. Think about the grammar of this sentence. God is the subject, God is the one acting. Enoch is not described as reaching some spiritual peak and transcending death on his own. He is not described as earning a reward. He is described as being taken, received, carried away by God. This is entirely God's action, God's initiative, God's decision. And that matters more than any other detail in the story, because it means the question what made Enoch different is ultimately a question about what God responds to. What kind of life prompts God to act in a way he has never acted before and, apart from one other figure much later, would never act again in all of recorded Scripture? The text is clear about what preceded the taking: 300 years of walking with God. That is the context. That is the condition Scripture places before this unprecedented moment. You do not have to be a theologian to feel the weight of that. You just have to be someone who has ever tried to be consistent in anything. 300 years. Not 3 weeks of fervent devotion followed by drift. 300 years. And then, at the end of those 300 years, at the age of 365, God took him. No announcement, no ceremony, no warning recorded in the text. One moment Enoch was here. The next, he was not. The silence after that verse is loud. The New Testament does not leave us alone with that silence. Turn to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. This chapter is one of the most majestic passages in all of Scripture, sometimes called the Hall of Faith. It is a recounting of the men and women throughout the Hebrew story who were defined by their faith, their trust, their surrender to God. And Enoch is there, Hebrews 11 verse 5. Listen carefully to what the writer says. By faith Enoch was taken up, so that he should not see death, and he was not found, because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as one who had pleased God. 3 things. First, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. This is not metaphor. This is not allegory. This is the New Testament explicitly confirming what Genesis implied, that Enoch bypassed death. He did not experience it. He did not pass through it. He was taken before it reached him. Second, he was not found. This phrase carries the echo of a search, of people looking for Enoch and not finding him. Something happened that was visible enough that others noticed, and obvious enough that the writer of Hebrews references it as a known, confirmable fact. Enoch was gone. He was looked for. He was not found. Third, before he was taken, he was commended as one who had pleased God. Commended. This word in the Greek carries the sense of testimony, of a witness being given on someone's behalf. Enoch had a testimony, and the substance of that testimony, the thing that was witnessed about him, was that he pleased God. He pleased God. That is the summary of a life. Not that he built great things, not that he defeated enemies, not that he accumulated wealth or power or influence. He pleased God. And that pleasure, that divine commendation, was the foundation for everything that followed. The taking, the bypassing of death, all of it. Verse 6 continues, and here the writer makes an application that connects Enoch's story to every person who has ever lived. And without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. This is the interpretive key the New Testament provides. Enoch's walk with God was a walk of faith. It was not merely moral discipline. It was not religious performance. It was faith, trust in God, belief in God, orientation of an entire life toward God, and that faith was what pleased him. And then there is Jude. The letter of Jude is one of the shortest books in the New Testament. But in verses 14 and 15 it contains something remarkable, a record of Enoch as a prophet, as a man who spoke. It was also about these that Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Enoch, the 7th from Adam. Jude identifies him precisely, counting the generations. And Enoch spoke, he prophesied, he declared, in the world of the pre-flood earth, in the world that was moving steadily toward corruption and judgment, that God was coming. That judgment was real, that the ungodly would be held accountable. This is not the portrait of a man who quietly withdrew from the world and kept his walk with God as a private, personal thing. This is a man who spoke, who declared what he knew, who stood in the middle of a corrupt age and announced that God sees, God knows, and God will act. Enoch was both a walker and a prophet. His life and his words both pointed in the same direction, toward God. Old Testament and New Testament together paint a portrait of one man whose faith was not performance, whose walk was not pretense, and whose testimony still echoes through the corridors of Scripture thousands of years after he was taken. So what made him different? This is the question that the story will not let us avoid. Because if the story of Enoch is just an interesting ancient mystery, a strange footnote in the genealogy of Genesis, it is remarkable but not particularly useful. But if the story of Enoch is meant to show us something about the kind of life that pleases God, then we need to understand it deeply. We need to look at it carefully. We need to let it say what it is saying. The first thing that made Enoch different was faith, not emotion, not intensity, faith. The writer of Hebrews is very specific about this. Enoch pleased God, and without faith it is impossible to please God. Therefore, Enoch's life, his 300-year walk, was fundamentally an act of faith. It was a life built on the conviction that God is real, that God is present, that God sees, and that God rewards those who seek him. In a world that was increasingly choosing to live as if God were absent, as if he were irrelevant, as if his standards did not apply, as if they could build whatever kind of world they wanted without consequence, Enoch chose to live as if God were real and near and attentive. Because he is. That is faith. Not feelings, not certainty in the sense of having all the answers, but a life organized around the reality of God. The second thing that made Enoch different was consistency. We have said this, but it bears saying again more slowly. 300 years, not a season of faithfulness, not a great spiritual beginning followed by gradual compromise. 300 years of walking in the same direction, of daily choices that accumulated over centuries into the kind of life that Scripture can summarize in 4 words. He walked with God. We live in a world that celebrates intensity. We celebrate the dramatic conversion, the powerful encounter, the sudden transformation. And those things are real and they matter. But Enoch's story is a reminder that what God values, what God sees and marks and ultimately responds to, is not the dramatic moment. It is the daily pattern. What are you choosing today, and yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that? Enoch's walk was not built in a single moment. It was built one day at a time over the course of 3 centuries. And the cumulative weight of those days, each one a choice, each one an act of faith, each one a small decision to keep walking toward God instead of away from him, that weight became something that God responded to in a way he had never responded before. The third thing that made Enoch different was his relationship with God, not just his obedience to God. There is a difference between a servant who obeys and a friend who walks together. Scripture does not say Enoch obeyed God, though presumably he did. It says he walked with God. That is relational language. That is the language of companionship and direction and shared presence. Enoch was not checking off boxes. He was not performing for an audience. He was walking with someone. He was moving through his life in awareness of and orientation toward the living God, in the context of fathering children, in the context of a corrupt world, in the context of ordinary human existence. And he did not stop. Now consider what we know about the world Enoch lived in. A world that was drifting. A world that had not yet reached the depths of Genesis 6, but was moving steadily in that direction. A world where walking with God was not the path of least resistance. It was the harder path. It was the path of someone who had decided that what God thinks matters more than what the surrounding culture is doing. Enoch made that decision, and he kept making it, every day for 300 years. That is what made him different, not supernatural gifting, not extraordinary circumstances. Faith, consistency, relationship. A life, an entire long life, pointed in one direction. Here is what we need to understand about the timing of Enoch's life. He did not live in a vacuum. He did not live in a world of general spiritual health, where walking with God was simply the norm that everyone around him also practiced. He lived before the flood. He lived before the moment in Genesis 6 when God looked down at what humanity had become and saw that the wickedness of man was great, that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. He lived in the generation that was building towards that verdict. And there is something quietly devastating about that context. Enoch's son was Methuselah. Methuselah lived 969 years, the longest recorded human lifespan in Scripture. And Methuselah's grandson was Noah, the man who built the ark, the man who survived the flood. The flood that destroyed the rest of the world came in Methuselah's generation. Enoch, walking with God, raised a son who would live to see the edge of judgment, and a grandson who would be the one man preserved through it. Enoch prophesied about judgment. He spoke it aloud in Jude's account. The Lord comes to execute judgment on all. He was not ignorant of what was coming. He was not a naive optimist who thought the world would keep improving. He saw clearly. He walked with God in a world heading toward destruction. He raised his family in that world, and he kept walking. That is the quiet warning underneath this story. The people of Enoch's time, the names we do not remember, the people who are not mentioned in Genesis 5 except as unnamed sons and daughters, they were living their lives. They're building, eating, fathering children, following the direction of their culture, watching the moral landscape around them shift and not finding it particularly alarming. The drift was gradual. The corruption was slow enough that it probably felt normal. You adjust. You accommodate. You tell yourself that things are not really that bad, and they were not paying attention. Meanwhile, one man in all of that world, was walking with God. One man had oriented his life around the reality of God's presence. One man was not drifting, and that man, only that man among all his contemporaries, God took. The flood came for the rest. For Enoch, God came first. There is something sobering about that, not something meant to produce fear for its own sake, but something meant to produce reflection. The story of Enoch is not just a beautiful mystery about one exceptional ancient man. It is a mirror held up to every age, including this one. What direction are you walking? What does your daily life, accumulated over months and years, actually add up to? Are you drifting with the current of your surrounding culture, or are you walking deliberately, faithfully, consistently toward God? The people of Enoch's world mostly missed it. They were alive, they were busy, and they were not paying attention. Enoch was. We come back, at the end, to where we began. A man who never died. A man who walked through a world of growing darkness and did not become dark. A man who lived 365 years in a world marching toward judgment and never stopped walking toward God. A man whose life scripture can summarize in one phrase, he walked with God, and whose death scripture cannot record, because death never reached him. God took him first. What are we supposed to do with that? The story does not give us a formula. It does not give us a 7-step plan for achieving what Enoch achieved. Scripture is not that kind of document. What it gives us is a portrait, a life, a testimony, a man commended by God, taken by God, remembered by God in a chapter full of death as the one name that defied the pattern. And the New Testament gives us the key: faith. A life built on the conviction that God is real and that he rewards those who seek him. Not a perfect life. The Bible does not make that claim about Enoch. Not a life without struggle or darkness or the weight of living in a broken world, but a life with a direction, a life walking with God. The question is not academic. It is not a question for scholars or theologians or people with specialized knowledge of the ancient Hebrew world. It is a question for anyone who will let it land. One man walked with God for 300 years in a world not walking with God, and at the end of those 300 years, God came for him, not as death comes, but as a friend comes, as one who had been walking beside him all along, simply continuing the journey together into a place where that journey never ends. One man walked with God and never faced death. The question is, why him? And the deeper question, the one that Scripture will not let you leave without considering, is this: what about you? What direction are you walking? And who are you walking with? The story of Enoch is ancient, but the invitation it carries is not. Walk with God. That is all. And it is everything.